He had ended 3 wars before his 30th birthday. Kings had knelt before him. Continents had surrendered to him. The Senate had given him a title no Roman had ever held, Magnus, the Great. And he had worn it without irony, because no one had dared suggest otherwise. Now, 7,000 of his finest cavalry were screaming toward 1,000 exhausted horsemen. The numbers were perfect. The plan was perfect. He had seen this before. He had always won. To defy the absolute power of the Roman Senate was to invite certain annihilation. Vastly outnumbered, Julius Caesar stood on the dusty plains, facing a colossal force certain of his doom. The earth trembled as 7,000 armored cavalry descended upon his fragile flank like a tidal wave of silver. But instead of breaking, a crimson flag was raised, unleashing a hidden, fanatical reserve of battle-hardened veterans. With ruthless discipline, they met the Republic's hammer head-on, orchestrating a counter-offensive of unimaginable audacity. Did this battle forge a glorious empire, or merely inaugurate a cyclical nightmare of blood? To understand what happened next, we must return to the dust of Pharsalus. The hidden blade and the shattered vanity. It was then that Pompey unleashed his hammer. Labienus, confident and aggressive, ordered his 7,000 cavalry to charge. 7,000 horses surged forward. It was a terrifying avalanche of muscle, armor, and 28,000 thundering hoofs. They kicked up a dust cloud so massive it obscured the sun. The young aristocrats, resplendent in polished silver armor, lowered their lances and screamed their battle cries, scenting an easy kill. A massive cloud of dust swallowed the left side of the battlefield as they drove their mounts toward Caesar's fragile cavalry line. As planned, the first phase of the engagement unfolded exactly as Pompey had envisioned. Facing this insurmountable wall, Caesar's small contingent of 1,000 horsemen engaged briefly before executing a desperate, deliberate retreat. Falling back in apparent panic, they pulled the Pompeian cavalry out of formation. Smelling blood, the young patricians rushed wildly into the gap, wheeling inward, ready to butcher the unprotected rear. Labienus' forces surged forward, stretching their lines, completely unaware that they were galloping headlong into a trap. They had completely fallen for the trap. As the retreating Caesarian cavalry cleared the front, Caesar gave the signal. A crimson flag was raised, and from the dust and the shadows, the Quarta Aces suddenly materialized. It was the hidden fourth line of 6 veteran infantry cohorts. There was no hesitation, no fear in their eyes. They did not hurl their weapons. They did not brace for a defensive stand. They surged forward with shocking speed, charging directly into the overextended, disorganized mass of the Pompeian cavalry. As they stepped forward as a single, unbreakable wall of grim, scarred faces, the terrifying reality of Caesar's radical order was unleashed. Caesar understood the sociology of his enemy. The Pompeian cavalry was largely composed of the elite youth of the Republic. They were young, wealthy aristocrats who prided themselves on their physical beauty and social standing. Thus, Caesar issued a chilling directive: Miles, Facium Ferri. Soldier, strike the face. He explicitly commanded them not to throw their heavy pila from a distance. Instead, he ordered them to grip the iron-shanked weapons firmly as thrusting spears, ignoring the horses' bodies and the riders' armored torsos, and aiming directly upward at their eyes and mouths. Caesar knew intimately that these men would rather flee the field entirely than risk being permanently disfigured, blinded or grotesquely mangled by the brutal, upward thrust of a filthy plebeian spear. They were accustomed to the obsequious deference of the lower classes and fiercely protective of their handsome, unmarred, aristocratic features. Those features were their absolute currency in the elite, politically incestuous social circles of Rome. It was a brutal, intimately violent command aimed squarely at the vanity and lack of true battle hardening among the elite youth. As the battle-scarred infantry crashed into the cavalry, the veterans thrust their iron-tipped pila upward. They aimed specifically for the eyes and cheeks of the aristocratic horsemen. Historical records from Plutarch and Appian frame this as a purely psychological masterstroke aimed at aristocratic vanity. They suggest these young men would risk their lives but not their handsome features. It is a compelling narrative, rich with the drama of class warfare and aristocratic cowardice. Yet, historical truth is rarely so theatrical. Documents carry the intent of their writer. The accounts of Caesar's victory were heavily shaped by pro-Caesarian propaganda aimed at humiliating the senatorial elite. When we strip away the rhetoric, a colder, tactical reality emerges. The physical evidence resting in modern archives speaks to a colder, biomechanical necessity. Consider a 60-centimeter heavy iron pilum shank, its dark metal violently warped and bent at a jagged angle from a single moment of impact. Infantry facing a massive cavalry charge cannot survive by throwing their weapons. The only way for men on foot to halt a horse is to form a wall of static points. Using the pilum as a pike, thrusting upward at the soft muzzles of the horses and the exposed faces of the riders, was not a psychological trick. It was a brutal, biomechanical necessity of survival. Whether driven by psychological horror or by sheer terror, the result was the same. It was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for the Pompeian cavalry. The young patricians, expecting to be the glorious hammers of the Republic, found themselves impaled upon an unforgiving anvil. Panic erupted. They threw their hands up to protect their visages, dropping their weapons and abandoning all pretense of discipline. The vanity of the aristocracy collapsed entirely in the face of the savage, survivalist brutality of the Marian mules. The magnificent cavalry charge faltered, stopped dead in its tracks, and then disintegrated into absolute chaos. They recoiled in absolute horror, dropping their weapons, turning their mounts, and fleeing the field in a disorganized, shameful stampede. They abandoned their allied archers and light infantry to be mercilessly hacked to pieces. They fled in blind, shrieking terror toward the surrounding hills. Their beautiful, pampered faces were left untouched, but their courage and their political legitimacy were entirely shattered. The mighty Pompey's cavalry had been utterly broken by a psychological blow to its vanity. The collapse of an era. With the massive Pompeian cavalry routed and fleeing into the distant hills, the chain reaction that Caesar had engineered was set in motion. The mighty hammer of Pompey's army had shattered into 1,000 pieces and vanished. It had completely exposed the left flank of his massive infantry formation. The Quarta Aces, Their twisted iron javelins dripping with the blood of the elite displayed the terrifying discipline of veterans. They did not pause to celebrate or pursue the fleeing horsemen. With ruthless efficiency, they flawlessly wheeled around to their left. Like a scythe cutting through wheat, they slammed violently into the unprotected rear and flank of the Pompeian infantry line. The collapse was systemic, rapid, and catastrophic. The battle had fundamentally turned. Pompey's infantry, already engaged and pressing hard against Caesar's front lines, suddenly found themselves being slaughtered from the side. At this precise moment, Caesar commits his fresh third line into the frontal assault. The exhausted Pompeian infantry, consisting largely of hastily levied recruits lacking fanatical devotion, was caught in a lethal vice. The psychological shock of seeing their invincible cavalry flee the field broke the spirit of the senatorial army. This was compounded by the sudden, terrifying pressure on multiple fronts. Pressed from the front by fresh troops and brutally rolled up from behind by the unstoppable fourth line, they could no longer hold their formation. The discipline, relentless coordination of the Caesarian veterans slowly and methodically overcame the sheer numerical weight of the senatorial forces. Panic spread like a contagion, and the sheer numerical weight of 45,000 men dissolved into a frantic, leaderless rout. Mobs of terrified men dropped their shields and fled for their lives. High on the hill, watching the battle from his command position, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus witnessed the impossible. He saw his magnificent cavalry, the instrument of his guaranteed victory, dissolve into a fleeing rabble. He saw his impenetrable infantry lines crumble into dust under the relentless red tide of Caesar's veterans. The psychological blow was total. The great conqueror of the East, hailed in his youth as the teenage butcher and the man who had ridden in 3 triumphs, simply lost his nerve. He did not attempt to rally his men or inspire a desperate defense. Turning his horse in silence, Pompey rode slowly back into his luxurious, ivy-draped camp. He retreated to his personal tent and sat down in the darkness, paralyzed by the incomprehensible scale of his ruin. When Caesar's vanguard breached the earthen ramparts, tearing down the myrtle branches and kicking over the silver tables set for a victory feast, Pompey stripped himself of his general's cloak. He fled through the rear gate with a handful of retainers, heading for Larissa. It was the beginning of a pathetic flight that would end with his murder on the bloody sands of Egypt. He left his army to die in the Thessalian sun. Pompey the Great was fleeing toward the treacherous, ancient shores of Ptolemaic Egypt. He was unwittingly riding toward a miserable death on a lonely sandy beach at the hands of eunuchs and mercenaries. His departure signaled the death knell of the senatorial army. Caesar, walking the position as the rout turned into pursuit, came at last into Pompey's camp. He found what his men had found, the evidence of a certainty so complete it had felt, the night before, like accomplished fact. In the great tent of Lucius Lentulus, the ivy grew along the doorposts, draped there for decoration as though the war were already a celebration. The tables were laid. The silver plate was arranged. The floors of the camp's command area had been covered in fresh-cut sod. The sleeping quarters were garlanded and sweet. The senators of Rome had come to Greece to watch Caesar destroyed, and they had prepared their dinner. The relentless sun began to set over the blood-soaked, pulverized plains of Pharsalus. They would have it so, Caesar muttered into the gathering dark, staring at the corpses of his countrymen. It was a heavy, deeply cynical epitaph for a republic that had essentially committed suicide by enforcing its own rigid, uncompromising laws. He looked at the dead on the field, after the pursuit had ended, in the cooling light of a late afternoon. Men he had known in the Forum. Men whose fathers he had dined with. Men who had spoken against him in the Senate, with the confident fluency of those who believe the institutions of the state are permanently on their side. His centurion Crastinus lay among the dead, with a sword wound through the mouth. He had called out to Caesar, at the battle's opening with a smile. He said, "General, I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." He was killed at the moment of the initial charge by a soldier of the opposing First Legion. That soldier had recognized him and brought him down with a single thrust through his open, cheering mouth. The record preserves that Caesar loved him for it. When the dust finally settled over the bloody plain, the scale of the carnage was immense. Julius Caesar claimed a staggering 15,000 enemy casualties at the cost of only 200 of his own men. This figure seems to secure his political legacy in his official commentaries. But history offers other witnesses. Other historians like Appian suggest a lower, yet still devastating, figure of approximately 6,000 Pompeian dead. They cite the accounts of Asinius Pollio, who himself fought in the battle. Regardless of the exact number, the heart of the senatorial army had been ripped out. The victor's pen often multiplies the fallen, but the earth absorbs them all the same. Today, the exact geographical coordinates of this slaughter have been obscured by 2,000 years of the Enopius River altering its course. It has hidden the mass graves from modern archaeological surveys. Yet, the topography still dictates the brutal logic of what occurred. On this plain, the Roman Republic is tearing itself apart. The Battle of Pharsalus ended as the sun dipped below the hills. The 500-year-old traditional Roman Republic, sustained by the Senate and the aristocratic elite, bled out on the muddy banks of the Enopius. This was not to be a sudden, unforeseen catastrophe. But it was rather the meticulous, calculated exhaustion of a centuries-old political consensus. It was a slow-motion collapse, culminating in a singular afternoon of mechanized slaughter. It is the ultimate, chilling paradox of the Roman Republic. Its death blow was not delivered by the shrieking, feral barbarian hordes of the deep Germanic forests. Nor was it delivered by the glittering, heavily armored cataphracts of the exotic, ancient East. It was delivered by the very men who had sworn sacred, blood-bound oaths to preserve the city of Rome. The Republic of Rome had ended. What rose from this dusty, scorched earth would no longer be a republic of laws. It would be an empire of men, forged under the absolute dominion of Gaius Julius Caesar. The systemic collapse of the ancient world order had only just begun, and a chilling, inescapable reality settled over the bloodied earth. What came next would take another 17 years. The true war was waiting patiently in the shadows, ready to exact a toll in blood that would dwarf even the nightmare of Pharsalus. It was the unending, cyclical nightmare of betrayal, dictatorship, proscriptions, and the eventual, bloody daggers of the Ides of March. Somewhere in the wreckage of the camp, a list was found. Names, written in a careful hand. Men whose property had already been distributed. Men whose houses had been leased to officers who would now never occupy them. The ink was still fresh, written that morning, before the horns sounded, by men who were absolutely certain of what the afternoon would bring. The men whose names were on it were still alive. The list did not know that.